All right, so we've got this shell here, and it's got a little bit of a bend to it. We could come over and maybe try optimize and unfold and whatever. It's not. I think it's about as happy as it's going to be. So what I want to do is I want to make it really, really vertical, especially on the center edge here, which is this back edge. And what I can do is I can select that edge. Again, you want to double click here in the UV editor, not out here, because if I do this, I'm going to actually grab the whole loop on the model. And what I'm looking for here is just the loop here in the UVs. I'm going to turn on scale by tapping the R key, and then I'm going to scale it flat. So I've already mostly oriented it by eye so that it is vertical, and then I'm just going to scale it, select that edge in the UV shell, and scale it flat. So once I've done that, I'm going to go to my pinning menu. Again, this is the UV toolkit. If you don't see this, you can just go to Tools and then Hide or Show UV Toolkit. And if it's floating around somewhere, you can leave it there, or you can dock it by simply dragging it over. You see the blue line, it'll go ahead and dock in. So I'm going to expand the pinning menu, and I'm just going to select the pin button. And what that's going to do is it's essentially going to freeze these UVs where they are in place, having been already flattened. So you select, you scale, you pin, and then with that, we can go ahead and do probably an optimize or an unfold. Kind of both these things at this point are going to give similar versions of the same answer. We're just essentially trying to relay out the UVs so that they are more closely aligned with our vertical axis here so that we get a little bit of a better bake. And the other thing that we can do, which might also help a lot, I'm going to go ahead, I think this right here, this area is actually kind of throwing these edges off. So it might make sense, this is what I want to do. I have to select these by hand, holding the shift key, because if I double select, it'll do the texture border. But with those selected, I need to turn off my Object X here. I'll just go to off, and I'm going to deselect these guys. Sorry, this is a mistake I make all the time. So what I want is I want to basically flatten these so that they're in the same orientation. But I forget sometimes that when you select an edge in UV space, there is almost always another edge when you're dealing with the borders that you have inadvertently selected. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to switch over to UV, and then I'm just going to do a drag select for all of these UVs. And now with the UVs are unique. I don't have any additional UVs selected, and I can go ahead and just slide them over. I'm going to find some point like this perhaps, and actually I'm going to leave them where they are because that was the average of all of the selection, and I'm going to go ahead and pin those. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. Just hold shift select, make sure I'm holding control to deselect that, back to shift select, and I'm going to scale these flat. And we'll pin those. And now I can do another optimize here, and you can see now we basically have a cylinder, and that's gonna pack very, very nicely. I'm gonna go ahead and do an unpin all. I'm gonna go to my edges here. I guess I've got to go back to UVs, and we're just gonna make this bottom border horizontal, and we'll do the same thing with this next edge up. So now we have a nice clean line here, and in addition to helping us describe the shape via the bakes that we're about to create, this also will pack more efficiently. So if I have this shell and I scoot it up like that, all of this area here is wasted space. But if I grab my UVs, yeah, that's what I want to do. Let me scoot it over a little bit so I get a better selection. We'll go to UVs, and I can make that flat. Now I can get a lot closer and I have a lot less wasted space. So that's kind of the idea. So with this thing here, we're just going to go ahead and rotate. That's okay. This one I'm going to go ahead and grab. So here's a trick. If I didn't want to select all of these UVs, you can see I'm double clicking on the shell and I'm getting all of these other edges selected. But you can go to select, convert selection to UVs right here, and then just do a control drag over the rest of these things. That's probably not easier, but it's just another way to go about it. And you can see, because my transform gizmo is over here, I have some other UVs selected. But once I've got that, I can do this. I'm going to go ahead and pin those UVs. And we'll just do a unfold, and you can see everything gets a little bit straighter. Let me do another optimize and see what happens. Okay, great. So these inside ones are real easy. They don't have, I don't think, yeah. So I just double checked. I can do a double select on the edge there. I haven't grabbed any other edges. And we'll just go ahead and do something like this. And this right here, I think I'm going to leave that alone. That's probably going to give me a little bit of distortion if I try to flatten that out, and it's not really that big of a deal. Okay, so, and let's see what's going on over here with this last one. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually head back over to my layout options, and we're going to look at another important setting. So we've already looked at preserve 3D ratios. We have options to rotate the shells as we're packing to try to find a more optimal arrangement. That's turned off by default because it takes a lot of time, because it has to go through every, like you can say, I want to rotate shells and I want this rotation steps to be 90 degrees. That means it's going to rotate every single thing at least 4 times and try a UV layout for each of those scenarios. So it's not, I mean, with this many shells, you wouldn't notice it, but it can add time. So I prefer to lay out the shells myself, or rotate the shells myself, and then I just disable this, which it's disabled by default. So I've got my translate shells here, which means we're just going to move. So this is moving, rotation obviously, and then this is our scaling. So this is kind of how we're doing all of our automatic transformation of the UV shells here. For this asset, I'm going to, let's just assume at some point I'm going to be baking this, and I'm going to be my bakes are going to be 2048 by 2048. That's a ridiculous amount of resolution for an object of this size, mostly because just imagine how big it would need to be on screen to justify 2,000 pixels worth of texture resolution. At some point that'll make more sense if it doesn't right now, but something like 1024 would be on the high end, and 512 would probably be really appropriate, because when you're seeing this thing in game, it's probably going to be pretty small. So it depends on the size of your monitor, obviously, but yeah, anyway, so but we're gonna do standard issue stuff. Like if this is a more detailed asset or something, you would just go with 2K. So shell padding here is an important setting. You can see if I lay out my UVs now, let me unpin everything, because if it's pinned, it'll not work. So I'm going to select everything, and we will go to layout UVs, and what it's going to do is it's going to put the UVs right up against each other. So there's a thing that happens in, it's really common in game engines, which is called mipping. And I don't really want to get too detailed into that because we're running a little low on time in the video, but just take my word for it. It's important and it's useful, but what you want to do is you want to make sure you've got a little bit of breathing room between your UV shells, because the mipping will cause a visual error otherwise. So I'm going to go to my shell padding here, and we'll just type in some value like 12. That's going to be 12 pixels per shell. So if I hit it now, you can see everybody gets a little bit of space on them, and because we've got so much extra wasted space in here, I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, and we're just going to, or 16, and we're going to go ahead and just give it a little bit more padding. So one of the things that we could do with this to get a little bit more space potentially is make it a little bit easier for Maya to pack it. So when you have one big shell like this, it's going to basically go, okay, I'm going to take this shell and I'm going to scale it so that it is maxed out in my 0 to 1 space, and then I'm going to force everything else to have that same amount of texel density. So one of the things you can do is you can break your shell apart. I don't know if this is actually going to make that much of a difference, because it just probably is going to do something very similar to what it's already got, but we can try. So we'll go to cut. Just going to put a cut in there, and we'll try laying out one more time. We've got to select them. Get the faces here. Right. So we talked a little bit about the getting and setting of texel density at I think at the outset of this conversation. So I'm going to go to transform, and we can do a get here. So I'm going to set my map resolution to 2048. And we'll hit get. So we can see we've got 227 is my pixels per unit. And if I add that cut in there and do a layout, we went from 227 to 243. So This is better in terms of the textile density and in terms of the amount of texture space that we're using, but we've just added an extra shell. So that's kind of one of those things where I was talking about earlier, where it's a little bit of a balancing act. Shapes like this, I mean, it just doesn't pack very efficiently. So something that you might consider is adding a cut there. Let's go ahead and, I don't think that's the bottleneck, but it might make a little bit of a difference. So with that, we can do another layout. Got to select everything again. Yeah, probably didn't make any difference at all. Same exact value. So I'm going to go ahead and put that back and just weld it together. All right, so that is a very quick crash course into how to create UVs and how to do your UV layout and how to get an optimal UV layout and what to look at as you are setting your shells, adding your cuts and all that kind of stuff. And also a little bit of a review of the layout UV options.